All right, good afternoon, and I would like to first of all thank you all for taking time out to hear my talk. There are some really good choices out there, and you being able to pick my talk for the slot is a privilege. All right, so I want to start off by just introducing the topic a little bit, so I've been working on this hard problem statement of testing generative AI applications in a highly regulated environment. We're going to touch upon that a little bit later in the slides, but I have happened to have a view of how the enterprise AI black box is evolving. So we'll appreciate that a little bit, and then we'll get into some of the challenges and then associated solutions with testing generative AI applications, right? So first things first, some of the industry insights. How many of us recognize this gentleman? No. So he's Microsoft's AI CEO, and he came with a very bold statement earlier in the year that generative AI models are going to achieve the capabilities of human abilities, and that might mean a lot of things for a lot of jobs, right? But then this person, do we recognize this person? He is Anthropic's CEO, right? So he came up with a very interesting statement 3 months before that. He said, AI firms must not make the same mistakes that we did with the tobacco products. This essentially means we need to be very, very cognizant of what kind of risk are involved when you're embedding AI in your processes or day-to-day life. What's that leading to? So a lot of people are very, very excited about the technology, right? There is so much hype. We all live in it. We all think it can come and do the wonders and transform the processes, right? But then there are other bunch of people who are then going and asking, what are the risks associated? And asking whom? Probably AI, right? There were some interesting studies last year again. So MIT said that 95% of the projects are never really going beyond POC phases. So of course, something is going on, something is very, very hard. Gartner supported that, and they said 30% of those probably will never be looked at. So they're kind of abandoned, right? So I consider that as a lost opportunity, really, So if you have a problem statement on hand and you start off with a POC, then probably there is an enterprise value in it. But because it is so hard to execute that, you end up abandoning that, right? Not a great shape to be in. And then McKinsey did a study last year. They said inaccuracy was quoted as the highest risk associated in embedding these technologies in the processes, right? So of course, so there is a promise in the technology. There is an opportunity that we all believe that exists, but then there is something going on which is extremely hard to crack, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, right? So let's look at how we are leveraging AI at most places. So it's mostly like a black box. So you ask a question, you get a response back, and under the hood, there is lots happening, but you are not necessarily having a view of what's going on, right? So it could be broken down into 3 layers in my view, right? It all starts with a business layer, right? So you remember that guy in the picture in the boardroom? Very excited, wants to transform the whole process. So business is very, very excited, and they don't want to lose the opportunity of being on the AI bandwagon. So they are constantly coming up with requirements. They are ready to do the data updates, and they are ready to provide you the feedback. So they want to be extremely engaged when you are building these processes. Well, when that is happening, the engineering teams have a hard choice to make, right? So the models are evolving on a day-to-day basis. Some of them are even getting deprecated. There are platform changes which are not even made visible to you. There is a decision around cost versus latency that engineering team needs to make. The tool integration, the orchestration, the prompts that you write to solve a particular business problem, those are all really fast moving parts, right? So you have requirements which are constantly evolving, and then you have engineering teams which have to tackle to all of these challenges. So that then makes a very, very big problem statement of you having a very strong feedback loop and a way to evaluate these systems quicker and faster, right? And those are not the only ones, right? there's a governance layer. So if you manage to get those two things right for a problem statement, and you take it to business saying 80% accuracy is what my system has been built with, you still have a challenge that, a regulation might turn up in the next month might say, like, you cannot process the data in such and such region, right? Or you cannot use it for this particular use case, or the model is getting deprecated. I think there was a mention about this in the keynote earlier, where there was a talk that probably the models are going to be changed very frequently in the processes that you have built. So essentially, governance, security, their actual benefit case measurement and realization, all of those are making these applications run into production, but then they are throwing challenges, because you will have to make the changes so that you are living up to the business expectations. So that translates into risks. So we know about how hallucination risk exists. It can give you incorrect responses. Remember the risk being the highest rated factor in the concerns that the peoples have. Data privacy and security. So the way we are interacting with AI, we end up sending a lot of data. Sometimes, we don't have a control over what information is flowing through when we have allowed our people to work with AI, right, in the teams. Bias and inconsistent response. So it's non-deterministic. You ask a question, you can get the same answer very, very rarely, right? So it is likely to change, but semantically it might mean the same thing, but sometimes it might also result in a scenario where you've got an answer which is completely, unfit for the purposes. This one is very interesting. A lot of the benefit that has been quoted in AI integration is around having, maybe people who do not have expertise to do a particular job. So you give AI to them, and then they get, acceleration in their day-to-day jobs. But then when they start to rely on that, then you remember that quote that Anthropic CEO has? Like, you cannot put all the liability on the person, that you will have to use this cautiously, right? And then the integration risk. So if you are building the process which is right at the top, and then that gets converted into issues that really rapidly cascades into downstream systems. So are we then building systems for this scenario? So we all believe that it's going to give you efficiencies, and there are already studies which are saying that people are going to spend their time reviewing the outputs, right? So of course, there is something that we need to do about the situation, because there is definitely a promise in the technology, and AI evaluation is the answer to a lot of these things, right? So let's look at why quality measurement is so hard. So we talked about it being non-deterministic. So the current ways of testing AI applications do not, they have the challenge, the legacy systems, we used to measure them by saying if A was to result in B, and as long as it gave B, then it was working, right? But then with the AI systems, it could result in B, C, D, E, semantically, similar, but very hard to automate. The changing capabilities, the models are changing all the time, the platforms are changing all the time. It's very, very hard to live up to the pace, right? Business is always wanting. So the frontier model scores are improving day by day, right? And there is a promise that they will achieve a lot of efficiency in a lot of various kind of domains, but that doesn't necessarily translate into value into your particular use case, because they don't have any exposure to the data that you have got, right? So them doing better in the data sets that which are publicly available doesn't necessarily guarantee you improvement in the processes that you are trying to build. There aren't many frameworks which are available, so definitely there is a lack of that. It's a bit of a greenfield area, and people need to have thought leadership to arrive at something which they can use to build some sort of eval harnesses which will give you a strong way of measuring the quality in the products. And last but not the least is the existing kind of thought processes is very, very cost intensive. So you build a system, you give to a bunch of business users, because we believe they are the ones who know the knowledge of the process, and only they can evaluate. That's a very, very expensive exercise, right? So all the evaluations which are purely built on human, centric processes, they are very hard to scale. And even if you were to go with something called as LLM-as-a-judge, which I'll introduce you guys to, or probably you already know, that is also a very expensive exercise and needs to be used very, very carefully. I'd like to introduce you to some of the metrics, right? So some of them are like, how do you define quality for any of these, processes? Like, so let's start from right to left. Left to right for you guys, sorry. So you could do the automation by building some of the rule-based stuff, right? So think of a chatbot. You ask a question and gets a response. You can put in some keywords. You can put in some regular expressions, put in some deterministic checks, right? So those are traditional way of doing the automation. We have always had NLP metrics in FN, Bluge, Rouge, right? So these are the data science fraternity metrics, which give you similarity score, basically, but not necessarily very good for the purposes of evaluating the performance of a Gen AI application. The one that you see in the middle, they are specific aspects of an AI application that you would build, right? So things like relevance, groundedness, usefulness, completeness of a particular response is something that is very critical for you to measure, right? And I will introduce you to the definition of these, and we'll try to appreciate this with an example a little bit later in the slides. But that's a very, very specific, set of KPI which is starting to emerge now, which you would have to benchmark for your rollouts, right? System metrics, latency. You build a wonderful system, it takes forever for you to give a response, doesn't fit the purpose, maybe beats your use case in the production, then that's not good either, right? So you want to measure the latency, you want to measure the robustness, and then this token usage aspect is something that I think all of us are appreciating. The cost of the tokens is only going to go one way, which is up, right? Microsoft increased the cost of Copilot by 7 times, right? Last few weeks. And similar thing happens with other models as well. They're burning a lot of energy building these capabilities. So the token is going to become a commodity, right? And we need to have a way to measure how much tokens we are really burning to get the real outcome that we are after. And the last one would be around the risk and the safety, especially for the ones that you're building for customer-facing applications. You want to check on the toxicity of the content, the prompt injection capabilities that end users might have, them wanting to get to your data, the biasness of the system itself, and any language and profanity-related issues that it might be emitting, right? So those are few. But then there are much more, right? But it's very, very hard because there could be a bunch of custom metrics that you want to, capture for that particular use case that you're trying to build as well. How can you measure them? So there are 3 broad category of automations that you could do. I talked about the code and the rule-based stuff, which is like, you can just write some code to do the keyword and regular expression kind of checks. NLP metrics, there is a lot of libraries available for you to throw data at it and get the metrics. But then LLM-as-a-judge is the technique which is evolving in the industry very, very rapidly, because only it can live up to the pace that is required to meet up the requirements that enterprise black box has. So let's say I'm running an application on a particular version of a model, and that model gets deprecated. Right? Now I have a challenge, to know how it would, when I upgrade my model, how am I doing with respect to that change? Business changes the data, they have a different requirement, you change a prompt. These things are very, very quick to achieve, but the quality measurement is very hard, right? So LLM-as-a-judge is a capability where you can automate some of those criteria using AI as a judge. So I mentioned about we're trying to look into the definitions of the metrics. So relevance is very simple. So you ask a question about a particular topic, you get the answer which is loosely or directly related to it. It's very relevant, right? Usefulness. A relevant answer may not always be completely useful for your scenario. Completeness. So an answer might be relevant, it might be useful, it may still not be complete, because it may not have all the data that you asked for. And even if it was relevant, useful, and complete, it may not still be grounded in the right information, right? So as long as it's not grounded in the right information, at an enterprise level, if you're building a system which is giving you information, if it doesn't come back with the right kind of, supporting information, you will have little confidence in using it. Let's try to understand with a very simple example. Imagine a chatbot which you guys have in your organization, and you ask a very simple question: what is my leave balance? And it comes back and says you've got 12 days. How do you think it's doing on all of those 4 KPIs that I mentioned? It looks like a relevant answer, right? Useful? I'm not too sure, because I might be wanting to get to more informations. I also want to know the source of the information. Completeness, I can't even comment because it has a very limited context associated with this. Groundedness, very low, because I don't even know whether it made up that information or it got it from a particular resource. Let's try to build on the conversation. So it's a multi-turn conversation now, and I'm now asking about, what does it include the rollovers from last year? It says the company information is around this particular topic is at such and such link, right? What do you think? Is it relevant now? It's not even relevant, right? But it is grounded, right? So information which is relevant and not grounded is as bad as information which is grounded but not even relevant. And such things can happen because if it doesn't maintain the context well, then you can have issues. What would a really good answer look like? Yes, it has 12 days of leave with 4 carry forward, and our company policy is at such and such place, right? Now that is a really good response emerging from a chatbot, right? Which has a yeses on all of these things. Right, those were those particular aspects, but then there are other things. Now imagine a system which is doing really well on those 4 aspects, but it is still not giving you a coherent answer, right? So it gives you information, but it's all haphazard, it's not consumable, and you cannot, so from a user perspective, it is not a very coherent answer, right? Well, it does all of that, but it doesn't do that consistently. That's another attribute for us to consider. Because if it doesn't do that for 5% of the times, and you're talking about thousands of interactions happening on a day-to-day basis, that translates into a significant risk for our enterprise. Latency, it does all of that accurately at an acceptable level, but it takes forever to get the answer. That defies your business use case. And the last one is the drift, right? Imagine it is doing all of this accurately, and then it slightly starts to deteriorate in production. You wouldn't even get to know because the answers are going to be convincing. Why can that happen? Anyone wants to take a guess? Why would drift happen? Yes, and? Again, go back to the enterprise black box that I mentioned about, right? So business now wants you to put a guardrail. They want you to put an instruction in the prompt. The model got changed, so they want to go up to the latest of the models. The governance people came back and said, you can't process in Australia, you have to go and process in US. So things change all the time, right? You consume that, you measure the stuff, but then, silently it is changing in production without you even knowing this. So what would the evaluation approach look like? So you could have options here, right? So at the moment, there are 2 kind of options. You could do a manual evaluation. So you basically have a bunch of business users, evaluate the outputs, and give a feedback. So let's see the positives and negatives of that. Obviously, manual review would be the best one, right? Because it's a direct feedback, only business understands that domain well, so they can give you a feedback which you can rely on. It has higher accountability and probably more confidence from a regulatory perspective as well. But it's very, very hard to scale. So you make a small change in the prompt, you give weeks of evaluation, it doesn't fit the purpose, right? There could be an inherent bias from human preferences into those feedback as well. It's very, very expensive and slow. So what do? You augment with the automation, right? That helps you scale the feedback loop that you are after, right? So just because you don't have a good feedback mechanism, you do not want to restrict your options, right? If you go to AI Foundry and some of these platforms where the models are there, it is so much option that you have to solve a particular business case, right? You need to have a feedback loop mechanism which is fit for the purpose and gives you cost-efficient way of living up to the pace of the change, right? And then you have to augment that with some optimal human engagement. But that's hard, right? So this is still an expensive exercise if it is not governed well. So a lot of the automation approaches are going to rely on LLM-as-a-judge, which itself consumes token, right? It can also be prone to the bias and inconsistency, and it needs an initial investment and effort to set up. So AI eval harnesses is what they are calling those things as, and pretty much every enterprise would need that as they go about doing their adoption of AI processes. How would an AI eval cycle look like? So it starts with any project, start defining the quality metrics. So you remember the big matrix that I showed a little while earlier? So you define the quality metrics which are applicable to your particular use case. Then you go about creating what we call as golden truth. So this is the opportunity for your engineering team to work closely with the business to create an evaluation test data set, which can then be run through automated evals, right? So these automated evals there are a lot of open source tooling and the capabilities within the platforms which are available for you to implement the automated evals. But essentially they use LLM-as-a-judge technique, but then you also have a choice to implement NLPs and your code-based checks as well. But so that little journey where you build golden truth and then you run it through automated evals, it allows you to do the experimentation at scale. So you can play around with your prompt, you can make choices on the models and get to a state where you think it is worth engaging human reviews and get the feedback back, and then that goes to production, right? And once it reaches production, you need to have a capability to measure something or less, performance in production, which is done through online evals, right? So those online evals are going to give you performance around the AI metrics in real time in production for every single transaction. And then that completes the journey. So you iterate around this cycle and you make new goals and you move on with that, right? But there is a trick to this, right? Once you've reached production, because setting up golden truth test data set is so hard, and it's an essential thing for you to implement the offline evals that we talked about earlier, we should probably try to have production observability feeding back into your golden truth test data set. I think I was talking to someone a little while earlier, and they were ahead in the journey where they had already got some evals going, but this is also emerging as a problem where people are struggling. 5 minutes. So people are struggling with keeping those online evals up to the mark. So this isn't something that just been cooked up. We've done some sort of work around this at a very, very regulated environment. I've got my team from ACC here, Liz and Faria, and what they've got is a very strong governance. Like the ACC as a government organization, they've kind of invested a lot in building strong governance around AI adoption in their processes and the point of proof of values and POCs. They've got really strong quality criteria for all of these POCs, and the focus on the evaluation data set has been there from the beginning, and we have built a framework, right? So I'll just quickly introduce you to that. A lot of the stuff that we are doing in ACC is on 2 core platforms. One is the Microsoft stack, and the other one is the Snowflake one. So what eval harness does is it has got a simulation layer. So it allows you to simulate that golden truth data set against those endpoints in a safe way, and then that feeds the data back into evaluation layer, which is then invoking the whole LLM-as-a-judge approach within the respective models, right? Why do we do that? Because we want to ensure that the data is properly governed and it is lying within the enterprise boundaries. And the last one is the reporting one, which then writes the reports back into those project spaces again, right? So we are kind of catering to the challenge of maintaining the data at a place where it is safe. There are some of the metrics. I do not have time to run through these, but you can find me outside and we can connect. Yeah. So the 3 key takeaways from today would be maximize your team's understanding of AI evaluation. grow your golden truth data set incrementally. So if you start your eval journey, you have integrated those things with your pipeline, you definitely have a feedback loop coming from production into your golden truth data set, and then you're reviewing your LLM as a judge prompt to check on their effectiveness. And the last one is never have humans out of the loop, right? So you're always wanting to have humans do the final layer of validation for you. So you iterate fast, you use AI as a capability to judge your outputs, but then you have humans doing the final layer of validation for you. Just want to end by saying that AI evaluation is an emerging area in the industry, and it is an art that you need to master for your responsible AI adoption, because it sets you up for some of the hard questions that you'll have in regulatory environment when the auditors arrive, right? So that's pretty much what I had to share. And of course, like, it is limited time, but I'm around. You can reach out to me or reach out to Planet Booth, where we can talk about these things in a bit more detail. Thank you so much.